My name is Cedric Kiefer. I'm the co-founder of Informative, a Berlin-based studio focusing on digital art and design. And just to give you an idea of how it looks at our studio. So we're at the moment about 8 people, and we work in a lot of different fields. So what is a little bit special for our studio is the fact that we are not focusing on one specific media, which means we are working on everything from interactive art installations, generative corporate designs, data visualizations, animations, kinetic sculptures. There's really no limit in what we're working on, but what is always the same, or what every project shares in one way or another, is the fact that it happens at the intersection of art, design, and technology at some point, somewhere. And when I got invited to speak at Fiber, I was looking at the topic of the conference and alchemy, and the more I actually started to get into it, and the more I read about it, the more similarities I recognized and found between how they worked back then and how we work as digital artists these days. And what I want to do is I want to show you some of the projects that we did in the past, some new projects that are not released yet, but also some older projects. And I want to point out these similarities. And what is maybe also special with this talk is that usually I'm showing a mixture of our self-initiated art projects and our commercial projects. In this talk, I'm only focusing on the self-initiated projects. And one thing that is super important for us, and which is obviously also where alchemy comes from, is the fact that you're trying to observe what is happening surrounding you. So you try to just look, see, and understand what is happening in the world. And I think this is something that is part of our work and how we start a project in general. And one of the projects that I want to show, to highlight that fact, is the Meandering River project. It's one of those self-initiated projects that we are working on for quite a while now, and it's close to being finished. And as with every project, this started with some inspiration that we found. In this case, satellite images that are almost painterly, super beautiful. And in this specific case, we were really fascinated by those rivers. So in a lot of satellite images, you find these meandering rivers. And what is so interesting is that they actually change the shape and course over the time. And at one point, they also disconnect, and this is how lakes actually are created. And it's just something that we were fascinated about. And at this point, we want to try to understand things like that. So, for example, here is a nice animated version where they had a satellite image taken each year, and you can really see how they start to move, and also how the river actually disconnects at one point, and a lake forms. And this is so beautiful that we wanted to understand how it actually works and why it happens. And at this point, we did a lot of research. So there are a lot of scientific papers about that topic. There is even a university here in the Netherlands that is actually dealing with these things, just to understand how rivers are actually shaping the world, how they change their path. And at this point, we wanted to work with that in some kind of way. But for us, it's always important to not just mimic something. We wanted to understand how it works, which is why we started to do some code research and started to recode and simulate that behavior. And what you see here in the beginning are some first tries that are not really working as expected. But as longer we were actually working on it, the better it got. So here, this is already a quite good simulation of that river behavior sped up. And the moment you have the behavior right, you can start to think about how are you going to use that, because maybe you don't want to show a river in the end. Maybe you want to think of this as a digital brush that actually moves over your canvas. which means you can draw images next to the river, or you can start to not even draw the river itself, but draw only the points and draw them over time, which becomes a totally different visual at one point. That's another iteration where we just kind of like had different versions over time, and here again didn't erase what the river was drawing, and you really see the path it took. And this is the moment where we felt, okay, there's a lot that could be explored there, and we were thinking about how far can we take it visually. And we had some quite extreme visual aesthetics that didn't really resemble a river any longer, but that was also the point when we felt that we should get closer again to those original inspiration images of satellite pictures. Because if you look at some of those satellite pictures, they are almost painterly. It looks like an abstract painting. And there's something really beautiful about it, which is why we decided to go with a look that is quite close to that aesthetic. And that's when we started to turn those river animations into shaders. We tried to come up with different layers that also simulated erosion, for example, and then developed different visual looks as you would find them on Earth. And this is, for example, one style. Well, this is another one. And what you see here is not 3D rendered, it's shader based, so it's running that simulation in real time. And what we want to do with it is, we always had in mind to turn that into a screen-based media installation running endlessly on those screens. And this is our vision. This project is not done yet, it's still in development, but this is our vision of how it's going to look like. So another thing that is often the case in alchemy is the transmutation from one form to another. So turning elements from a liquid state into a solid state, or the other way around. And often in our projects we also don't really either decide what form it might take, or at one point we want to turn it into something different. And in this case, something that was planned to become a video installation, maybe turn it into a digital sculpture, a physical sculpture. So this is another concept coming from the same data set, the same simulation, but in this case materialized as a 3D sculpture where you see the change over time, frozen in time. So the next project that I'm going to talk about is a little bit older, actually quite old, and I didn't want to show it at all, but there are some really interesting points about that project and the correlation with alchemy that I think are interesting to point out. Because the reason why I'm not showing that piece any longer is because, well, I have to give a little background. The piece is actually sound visualization or a dance visualization. And if you go on Instagram these days, you see like every other channel has like a colored body moving or dancing, because it's super easy to download those motion capture files and just load it into Cinema 4D and then create an abstract character. But what we wanted to do like 5 years ago was at a point where you were not easily able to download those data sets, or were able to get your hand on motion capture data of that kind. And this is why I'm talking about this project, because one of the important points is the fact that you have to start building your own tools then. So if a tool doesn't exist that solves the problem, you have to start to look into building your own tools. And as already said, back then there was no really way to capture that kind of movement. By now it's super easy, but this is actually the fact why you do it. This is why you have to start at some point to come up with solutions. And what we did, everybody might know that, we used a Kinect camera, or let's say not only one, but we used an array of 3 Kinect cameras that gave us an area in the center to record her body movement. So that's one point, being able to get your hands on material that you usually cannot work with. And the other thing is that happens next is also probably something that has a connection to alchemy, and it's the fact that you try to extract or get to the smallest possible element of that material. So you try to get to the core, or think about atoms. The moment you work with that, you can actually create everything else, because there's nothing much smaller than that, and the whole world is made out of those little elements and bits. In our case, data points, specific positions of that body, which is what we have been working with, and then had the chance to turn that into whatever we wanted to. So this is the raw data, but at that point we were able to decide, do we want it to be fluid, or do we want it to be solid? Should it be rock-like? Should it be fluid-like? That was up to us at this point. And this is where a longer iteration process started, and where we have been looking at a lot of different ways to visualize the data that we have. So I'm going to stop that here and going to show you just a short version of that final piece, which is a little bit closer to the original music piece. As said, usually, or I have been talking about that piece in more detail, but it was especially important for me to make those 2 connections, which I think are super important. And also a fact why I showed it is there's a step in a progression towards the next project that I'm going to show, which is Collide. And Collide is a digital art piece, screen-based art piece that was commissioned by Dolby to work on something for their headquarters in San Francisco as a digital screen installation. And we again started to think about visualizing motion data, dance data, because it's just something that we have been working on for quite a while, and that we wanted to push forward and explore further. And for quite a while we have been, or with the piece that I just showed, we have been only focusing on the body itself. So there was a black, empty void, empty space the body was performing at. But this time we were way more interested about not showing the body, but actually showing the space that the body is occupying. So with a lot of projects, again, it starts with analyzing the kind of data that we might have, understanding what is happening. And what we do here is we analyze and look at the energy that flows through the body, or we try to understand what kind of muscles are activated the moment you move. And at this point, again, we iterate. We test out different things, we explore. And what you see here is a constant progression and different visualization of the same data set. So, as already mentioned, what was important for us here was to not show the body itself. So we were more interested about what happens in the space around it. So the things got interesting for us the moment they got more abstract. almost to a point where you were not able to see that this is dance or motion data. And while we were researching and we were analyzing, we also talked to some performers and dancers. And one thing that stuck with us and that we got fascinated about is the fact that they have been talking, or they started to talk about the feeling when you perform and you get lost in that performance. So everything fades out, you just focus on that performance, and the outside world just kind of gets blurry. And I think it's something that is not only the case for dancers, but probably also in sport, but also for the creatives in different disciplines. The moment that you're focused and you're in the zone, everything else kind of like fades out a little bit. And this is something that we thought is super interesting, and we wanted to visualize how that world might look and feel. So we have been using those motion data sets to create that vision of that abstract world and make the screens the window into that world. So what you see here is the motion data being visualized, and you sometimes see elements coming close to the screen and quickly disappearing again. And while doing so, we created an abstract world of totally different styles and made that the part of the next step of the process. Because as it was a project commissioned by Dolby, it also included sound, obviously. But it was important for us to not only take that piece and give it to a sound designer and ask him to do a score for it on top of a video. We wanted to stay true to that experience, or the thing that we just explained, the fact that you as a creative get lost in the creative process, which is why we invited 3 cello players and we actually put them inside of that virtual space. So these 3 cello players were wearing Oculus VR glasses, and they were looking at different parts of that space. They were actually performing inside of that abstract world, not able to see themselves or each other, but just to kind of like hear it. And the moment something was happening in front of them, they reacted to it. In that kind of sense, it was a little bit the opposite to what we did with a sound sculpture, where the musician was actually reacting to the music. Now the musicians were actually reacting to the visuals. And this is how we created the score for that piece. So in the end, we had a 10-minute visual running on that screen. And the nice thing about it is that this space had not only a beautiful screen, but also 150 speakers, which means the sound was actually happening everywhere in that space. You were able to move it at any position, so it was really accompanying the visuals at any time. And you had really the feeling of elements moving next to you, which was really nice. So the next and last project I'm going to show today is also a project still in development. And if some of you have already seen like a talk a year ago or 2 years ago even, I might have mentioned that project, because those self-initiated projects sometimes start and then they pause again, and sometimes we need to learn things and we need to iterate. And the project is now close to being finished, or it actually is finished. It's also already documented, but not exhibited yet. But I'm going to show it here, obviously. So True Falls is a kinetic light installation. And again, as with the river project that I showed in the beginning, there is inspiration at one point. So inspiration, in this case, came from those old analog displays that you might know from airports. And we were thinking about doing something like this on our own. We felt the need to create something analog, so something that has that analog feel to it. And instead of coming up with a grid of individual motors, we thought we might come up with a system that maybe makes it a little bit easier. So because instead of having like one motor behind every element, which easily adds up to be, well, if you have a grid of 10 by 10, you have already 100 motors. We thought we might be clever and actually just put one motor underneath each column. And by a clever movement of those elements, you're actually able to turn those dots into every position, and it becomes a display. I'm going to explain a little bit how that kind of mechanic works and that algorithm works in the next step. But the important point that I want to make here is the fact that that was the moment when we realized that the fact that you can use it as a display is nice, but what is way more interesting is the way it animates. So what you see here is nothing that we did on purpose. What you see here is what the algorithm does. So you can actually see the algorithm at work. And we felt that this is something to look at a little bit closer. So we have been focusing on the animation itself. We didn't really work on the piece as a kinetic sculpture any longer, but we were focusing on trying to understand why it moves like that and what could be done. And this brings me to another point that I would actually connect back to alchemy, and is using chance to your advantage, which reminded me of probably the classic story if you talk about alchemy, is the fact that they tried to create gold, but in the end they ended up with porcelain, which they didn't intend, which is maybe not what they wanted, but they obviously created something really useful and beautiful. And I think this is something that could happen in your daily work as well. So what we initially tried to do is build a kinetic sculpture, but at this point we found an algorithm that is beautifully to look at and beautifully moves. And at that point we were also thinking it further, and we were wondering, if it moves beautifully, how would it sound? So we did a side project and turned that into a screen projection and music piece where we assigned different instruments to those different columns and had it play. And at this point you were able to not only look at the algorithm but also listen to it. In the end, we still wanted to build that display. I mean, that was the plan from the very beginning, and if you have that idea, you want to do it. So we got back to the drawing board, learned a lot about electronics, made some plans how to actually build that, and then we started prototyping. So it's a lot of experimentation as well. You don't know what happens, you just need to try it out. So the first prototype that we built was this 3D printed, and now you might actually get and understand the mechanic behind it. What happens here is there's one motor that is driving different, in this case 3D printed elements, moving around a light tube. So what turns the pixel white and black is actually just the piece blocking the light. And that was the first point where we had a really good feeling about it, because we knew, okay, this is working. It's super easy to come up with a concept that works as a rendering or as a software prototype, but building something physically is something totally different, which is also what we quickly realized. Because, well, that's a prototype. Now it has to be done in a way more stable way. So again, back to the drawing board, building electronics, circuit boards, and coming up with a second prototype. In this case, a way better control software, not only controlled randomly, but being able to really assign single pixels, and also having two columns that were working together. And that was the point where we thought, okay, now we got it. We just need to kind of like do 25 of them and we're done. But there was something that we forgot about, and it's the fact that, the heating of the lamps actually changes the scale and the size of the elements just a little bit, but enough to prevent it from moving. And the friction at the end was too strong, and the plastic was too weak to really work constantly on a longer time frame. So the idea of us building something that is a little bit bigger as a wall-mounted installation, got problematic. So we had to kind of think about using different materials, which was the point when we started to think about not doing it as a 3D printed element, but maybe creating CNC milled elements. So with some help from some talented people, we created new pieces and we started to CNC mill them. And now you might understand how they look like in detail. And we have, I think, about 600 of them created. So now we have a new prototype. It's always kind of like iterating and testing. That finally works the way it should. And what is super nice about it, and something that we didn't really kind of like plan, is that we got the sound back. So if we think about that split flap display that always has that characteristic soundscape, we knew, okay, we're getting that with that sculpture. And this is just kind of like one column moving. And yeah, we were really curious to hear how it would sound if we have 25 of them. So that was the point when we had a really good feeling about replicating it and really going into production and turning it into something, yeah, real. So we anodized them, so we really have black elements, not silver elements anymore. And then we started to, build it more or less. And what you see next is the final sculpture, currently hanging up on the wall. And something that I probably didn't mention yet is what is actually shown on those screens. As already said, the fact that it's a display is something that doesn't really interest us that much anymore, but it's the process that happens between one image and the other. So what this sculpture does is it automatically generates content on its own and just processes it. So it constantly recreates a new image, starts the transformation from one image to the next one. The moment it's done, it creates a new one, and it goes on forever. So this is a rough cut of the video that we did that shows you all the different kind of like patterns that it actually creates during that transformation, but you also hear the sound a little bit better now. Thank you. So yeah, I think as always, if you have some questions, please feel free to ask right now, but also ask in the lobby. I will be around for sure. Yeah. It is grayscale, but in theory you can also stop them half the way. So you have, we tested it, so you can create gradients. So if you turn the first one 180 degrees, 170 degrees, 160 degrees, you start to see transitions, but not strong enough in the end to create grayscale images. Cool, thank you very much.